trade routes, confusion, and the architecture of control. Most of us were taught to think about a trade route as a line on a map, a road, a river, a caravan trail across the Sahara, a shipping lane across the Atlantic. Goods start here, travel there, and eventually arrive someplace else. But that description leaves out the most important part. A trade route is never just a path. A functioning trade route requires rules. Someone must decide who may travel. Someone must protect or threaten the traveler. Someone must determine what may be carried. Someone collects taxes. Someone establishes acceptable currency. Someone settles disputes. Someone controls the port, the bridge, the marketplace, the border, or the customs house. And wherever people move, ideas move with them. Languages move. Religious beliefs move. Technology moves. Political alliances move. Stories move. Knowledge moves. That means a trade route is not merely geography. A trade route is an institution. And once we understand that, we can begin to recognize something much larger about power. Because power has always depended upon controlling corridors. Consider West Africa. For centuries, the trans-Saharan trading networks connected West African societies with North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Gold moved north. Salt and other goods moved south. But so did scholarship, commercial practices, religious ideas, diplomatic relationships, and information. The camel caravans that crossed the Sahara were carrying much more than merchandise. The British Museum notes that flourishing trans-Saharan networks helped carry Islamic teachings into West Africa, while control over access to those networks supported monetary and commercial systems farther north. The Metropolitan Museum similarly describes the trans-Saharan gold trade as linking Mediterranean economies to West African gold-producing societies. Look carefully at what that means. A road connected markets, but the road also connected institutions, and whoever could govern the road possessed something larger than transportation. They possessed leverage. The Songhai understood that. When Songhai expanded its control over Timbuktu, Gao, gold trade, salt mines, and trans-Saharan routes, territorial power and commercial power reinforced one another. The route was part of the state. That is the structural lesson. Now move forward several centuries. The technology changes. The principle does not. Today we call them economic corridors, rail corridors, port corridors, digital corridors, energy corridors, mineral corridors. The modern Lobito corridor, for example, is being developed to connect mineral-producing regions of Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo with Angola's Atlantic coast. But nobody serious treats Lobito as merely a railroad. Financing institutions are involved. African governments are involved. Foreign governments are involved. Mining interests are involved. Port operators are involved. Development banks are involved. Customs rules, border procedures, investment agreements, security arrangements, and geopolitical competition are involved. The World Bank even uses the term corridor management institutions. Because successful corridors require coordinated governance, not simply pavement and steel. And as of 2026, billions of dollars in financing are being assembled around the Lobito system, precisely because the corridor affects access to copper, cobalt, international markets, and geopolitical influence. Same principle, different century. Control the corridor and you influence what moves through it. But now we have to make the turn, because not every corridor is physical. Suppose you need a government benefit, or a permit, or financial assistance, or the right to challenge a decision, or information about your eligibility. There may be no caravan, no railroad, no ship, but there is still a route. You must discover the program, understand the language, locate the correct office, meet the deadline, produce the correct document, understand the exception, complete the form, interpret the notice, possibly appeal, possibly wait, possibly call somebody who sends you someplace else. And suddenly we discover that procedure is also a corridor. Information is moving. Authority is moving. Permission is moving. And you are trying to move through the system. That changes how we should think about confusion. We normally treat confusion as a communication problem. Somebody wrote a bad letter. The website is poorly designed. Two offices gave different answers. The instructions are unnecessarily technical. Perhaps. Sometimes bureaucracy is simply bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does best, producing three forms where a sentence might have worked just fine. But structural analysis requires another question. Who benefits when the route becomes difficult to navigate? Public administration researchers use the term administrative burden to describe the costs people experience when interacting with government. Those burdens generally fall into three categories: learning costs, figuring out what exists and what the rules mean; compliance costs, forms, documentation, appointments, deadlines, and procedural requirements; psychological costs, frustration, uncertainty, stigma, anxiety, and loss of autonomy. Notice what those costs can do. They do not have to formally deny access. They can simply make access harder. The door remains technically open. The corridor remains technically available. But enough obstacles can reduce how many people successfully travel through it. That is why researchers and governments increasingly talk about sludge, unnecessary friction embedded in procedures. The OECD now evaluates things like waiting time, uncertainty, confusing instructions, hidden steps, and unnecessary complexity, because these frictions can prevent people from effectively navigating public systems. And there is an important distinction here. We should not assume every confusing procedure was intentionally created to discourage people. Sometimes complexity grows from fragmented institutions. Sometimes rules accumulate. Sometimes nobody redesigned the system after 20 years of patches. Sometimes one department simply does not know what another department is doing. Government occasionally manages confusion without requiring a mastermind. But sometimes obstruction is deliberate. American history gives us no shortage of examples. Literacy tests once stood between black citizens and the ballot box. They could be presented as neutral requirements. In practice, they became instruments of racial exclusion until federal law prohibited their discriminatory use through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The rule did not have to say, "Black people cannot vote." The institution could instead say, "Complete the procedure." That is a very different sentence. It can produce a very similar outcome. Now the two lessons come together. A physical trade corridor determines who and what can move across space. An administrative corridor determines who and what can move through institutions. Both have gates. Both have gatekeepers. Both have rules. Both have language. Both have costs. Both have choke points. Both can expand access. Both can restrict access. And both can hide power inside something that appears routine. A customs checkpoint looks administrative. A complicated benefits application looks administrative. A railroad agreement looks technical. A voting requirement looks procedural. But procedure is often where power stops announcing itself. It simply becomes normal. This is why structural literacy matters. When most people encounter a confusing system, they ask, "What am I supposed to do?" That is a necessary question. But it cannot be the last question. Structural literacy asks, who designed this route? Who controls the gate? What must a person possess to pass through it? Who bears the cost of navigating it? Who receives the benefit when movement becomes easier? Who benefits when movement becomes harder? And perhaps most importantly, is the confusion an accident, an accumulation, an incentive, or a strategy? Those questions move us from frustration to analysis. African history helps us see this because African societies understood corridors long before modern management consultants discovered a PowerPoint slide for them. Trade routes joined markets with political authority. They connected people with knowledge. They connected place with memory. They connected resources with institutions. They could strengthen sovereignty. And when outsiders captured critical interfaces, ports, trade access, finance, shipping, or strategic routes, the balance of your route could remain. Your resources could remain. Your people could remain. But somebody else might increasingly determine the terms under which everything moved. That is a deeper definition of control. And that brings us to the present. We live inside corridors we rarely recognize. Banking systems, insurance systems, schools, voting systems, healthcare systems, digital platforms. immigration systems, corporate workplaces, government agencies. Each has a route through it. Each has rules about what counts as acceptable knowledge. Each determines which documents matter. Each determines who may authorize action. Each determines how long people must wait. Each produces language explaining why the system works the way it does. So when the language becomes vague, when standards suddenly shift, when one office contradicts another, when deadlines move, when explanations multiply but clarity somehow declines, do not immediately assume conspiracy, but do not dismiss structure either. Ask the corridor question. What is trying to move through this institution, and what is stopping it? What is important and unseen? The unseen connection is that infrastructure and information perform similar governing functions. A road organizes movement across territory. A procedure organizes movement across authority. A port determines whether goods pass. A form can determine whether a citizen passes. A customs officer can stop cargo. An undefined standard can stop a decision. A captured trade corridor can produce dependency. A captured information corridor can produce paralysis. And confusion itself can become consequential whether it was deliberately engineered or simply allowed to accumulate. Because once people cannot understand where authority sits, what standard applies, what evidence matters, or what happens next, their capacity to act begins to shrink. That is when confusion stops being merely frustrating. It becomes structural. Predictive trajectory. The institutions of the 21st century will increasingly compete over corridors that are not merely physical. Mineral corridors, data corridors, payment systems, digital identity, artificial intelligence infrastructure, supply chains, migration routes, information platforms, administrative systems. The struggle will increasingly concern not simply ownership of resources, but control over the pathways through which resources, knowledge, permissions, and decisions move, which means learning to identify the corridor may become as important as identifying the institution itself. Critical thought. What we need to do when confronted with any system, teach yourself to map the route. Identify the entry point. Identify the gatekeeper. Identify the rules. Identify the choke point. Identify who bears the burden. Identify who controls interpretation. Identify what happens when somebody cannot successfully navigate the system, because power does not always stand in front of us wearing a uniform. Sometimes it looks like a road. Sometimes it looks like a port. Sometimes it looks like a policy. Sometimes it looks like a form. And sometimes power simply hands you 12 pages of instructions and quietly waits to see whether you make it through. The road and the paperwork may look like two entirely different things. Structurally, they are asking us the same question: who controls the corridor? This has been a Freedom School Academy production. Visit us at freedomschoolacademy.com.